Culas Cancorla. And can I start off, Minister, by saying that I'm really pleased to see this piece of legislation before the House today, because in fact I worked on this legislation for many years in the European Parliament, and not just in its final stages, when it was already a draft document and in committee and then in the Parliament itself, but in fact trying to ensure that this legislation got on the statute books in the first place. And when I was first elected to the Parliament, Cathy Sinnott and myself founded the Carers Interest Group, and that was one of the first recommendations from that group, and I remain to chair that group for between 10 and 15 years, co-chairing some of the time. But this was one of our main priorities. And in the European Parliament, as you know, there's no government and there's no opposition, so the Commission come forward with proposals. And I just want to put it on the record that we worked with some excellent people from the Commission in trying to get this proposal to the point where it became a piece of legislation. And sometimes people in this House and elsewhere talk about the Commission as faceless bureaucrats. We met the best of people, ordinary people, people who have care responsibilities, people who have lives like the rest of us. And they understood this. And it was a long process because, of course, with the crash in 2008, all social legislation was put to one side, which was a disaster for Europe. So I understand people's concerns there. But when we were able to recover a little bit, and especially in my last term from 2014 to 2019, social Europe was much more to the fore. And this was one of the pieces of legislation that was meant to reflect that. But as I said, a lot of people helped bring this legislation to where it is today. And in fact, it was one of the last pieces of legislation that we passed in the European Parliament, I think April or May, just before I left. So, as I said, I'm very pleased it's where it's at, and I'm very pleased with whatever small role that I played from its inception, which is a very long time back. Now, this directive is quite a broad-based directive. Not all directives are as broad-based as this is. And I suppose because we have 27 member states with 27 different systems when it comes to maternity, paternity, carers leave, all different kinds of leave. And it has to try and work with systems and not against them. For example, some countries have better maternity leave than others. And we often look to the Nordics and talk about what they have. But in truth, when it comes to these issues, Ireland is most certainly not behind the door. And in fact, our carers leave here, where somebody can take up to 2 years off and receive carers benefit, is seen as a flagship in the EU and globally. Many countries don't have that, and it's not perfect. And for example, I believe carers benefit should bear some relationship to whatever salary somebody was on, obviously not open-ended, perhaps up to the median wage or something like that, because if it's not paid well enough, well then most people won't take it. So for something to be meaningful and to be real and to be available to people, then there has to be a certain level of benefit with it, shall we say. But it is worth noting that, we're well ahead of the posse there. So you might say, well then why do we need this piece of legislation with the carers leave and other aspects, which I will come back to? It's because we actually do need something to bridge that gap, because not everybody wants to take 2 years. I mean, you can't take carers benefit for less than 13 weeks. Not everybody wants to or needs to take that much time off. They might just want to take shorter amounts of time, and to some extent this legislation, as I said, helps to bridge this gap. Now, I've heard people say that, question this legislation. In my view, this is important legislation, and this legislation reflects the reality of the lives of so many people, and it's far from perfect. But it will help to ease some burdens here and there, and it reflects the reality of people's lives. And as I said, Minister, there are gaps, and I'll mention some in a few minutes, but it is going in the right direction. It's also late. A lot of people are congratulating ourselves on what we're doing here, but we are actually a little bit late, but not much, and hopefully it'll be on the statute books fairly quickly. Now, some of the issues that I want to raise here, and I will be putting down a number of amendments, but this bill refers to 5 days unpaid leave being for a significant medical issue. Now, that term is quite vague and open to interpretation, so I don't know if you can tie that down any further, Minister, and I don't know who's going to be the judge of that, but all legislation should be as tightly worded as possible. Secondly, the bill stipulates that leave cannot be taken for less than 1 day. I don't know if there could be some flexibility there around a half day. Sometimes that's all that's needed. Perhaps it's not possible, but just maybe you might think about it. And the year, the 5 days within the year, is that simply a calendar year from when the first day's leave is taken, or could it be a rolling year? You know, for example, in certain professions, the length of sick leave that you can take can be rolled over 4 years. I'm just wondering what the situation is here. Now, the 5 carers' leave days provided within this bill are unpaid, meaning that the carer in question will have to assume the financial penalty. So, for example, if a carer has to take an unpaid day off and maybe needs a cert for €60, that means they've not only lost a day's pay, but they are also out of pocket for the cert. Now, I know, Minister, that some companies have already said that they will pay this, and I know some will, and I know some won't, and I know some can't. It's not a question of these are bad employers. It's because sometimes businesses can't. So, you know, this is good, but it's not the perfect solution, perhaps, that everybody is saying it is, because people are taking this leave, you know, at their own cost. And I know when we were going through this legislation at European level, we looked and we tried, certainly within the Parliament, to say that this leave should be paid, but we just couldn't get agreement with the European Council because some member states would support it and others wouldn't. But that, of course, wouldn't prevent any country, and in this case Ireland, from trying to ensure that. And I'd be interested in hearing from you about your discussions with employers' organisations, what they said to you about this, and what are the possibilities of, even at a future date with a review, that could be part of this legislation. This bill gives a right to request flexible working, but it gives a right to request it, but that's it. The employer can refuse. Now, I see you have various protections here, various steps that need to be taken by the employer, so it's a process. It's not just, I'd like the time. No, there's a process. But even at that, it's still, you know, far from certain for many people. And if it is the employee's right to challenge the decision, but you know, they have to go to the WRC, and we know that there's a long delay. You could be looking at up to 12 months. So, I mean, there is a sense that justice delayed is justice denied. But I suppose, to be fair, it is a further safety net, as it were, that people, if they really feel that the decision of their employer is unjust, that they can go to the WRC. But I'm just wondering, would there be any possibility of some other system, and maybe not immediately, that just wouldn't take so long? But I'm just throwing it out there. Now, the directive itself refers to flexible working arrangements being for a reasonable duration. The bill doesn't clarify what a reasonable duration might be, so that's left open to interpretation. Again, I understand maybe that you're trying to be as flexible as possible here, but sometimes that means that people lose out. I don't know if there's anything stronger that could be put in there. I have a concern that part of the bill requires an employee to provide to their employer, and I'm just quoting here, the employee's relationship to the person for whom medical leave is sought, and this is the concern, the nature of the personal care or support required by the person in respect of whom the leave for medical care purposes is sought. Now, to me, is there an issue here around GDPR and sharing information with a third party, often maybe sensitive information, because by virtue of the person's relationship with the person they look to get time off to care for, then it's very easy to identify that person. So I just wonder about that, Minister. And also the bill specifies the persons for whom flexible working or carers leave can be applied for, and they are a person of whom the employee is a parent or adoptive parent, the spouse or civil partner of the employee, a person to whom the employee is in loco parentis, the cohabitant of the employee, a parent or grandparent of the employee, a brother or sister of the employee, and a person other than one specified in any of those paragraphs who lives in the same household as the employee. Now, that's broad enough, but that definition excludes applications in respect of care provided to non-relatives who don't live in the same household, or other relatives such as uncles or aunts or cousins who don't live in the same household. And I think, Minister, this is particularly important as the Irish family evolves. And the family of choice, we might call it nowadays, that's much more common, particularly for the LGBTQI plus community. I think it may also be at odds with the pending referendum on Article 41 to extend the definition of families. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration here. Finally, just a few comments to finish up. The extension of breastfeeding breaks, I mean, that's really important. It just normalises it. It's a normal, natural thing, and that's how it should be. The domestic violence leave, I'm very happy to hear what Minister McEntee has to say, but in truth that needs to be introduced as soon as possible. Not just the leave itself, but the development of workplace policies to support victims. So again, I'll be putting in some amendments on this, but it does give me some comfort to know that the Minister is determined that we'll not be waiting any length of time for this, because we cannot, Minister. My last comment is, and this was referred to by one or two of my colleagues here, the need to ensure maternity leave for all politicians, and paternity leave. Not just maternity leave, paternity leave as well, for people in this House and for councillors. Earlier I spoke of, we have a young person coming in to visit here. Earlier I spoke of normalising breastfeeding. This would simply normalise women's involvement in politics, and I think it won't do it completely, but it will go a long way towards it. And it's interesting that we look up when a child comes in here, because we don't often see children in this place. Recently, I think, was one of the first times we saw a child in this chamber, and that's a good thing in itself, and it normalises family life, who we are. And coming back to what I said earlier about this legislation, this reflects the reality of people's lives, and it will help ease some of the burdens. So I strongly welcome it, Minister. I'll be submitting amendments, and hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss them further. Thank you.